This was meant to be a story of perfect restraint, but it became a chronicle of a beautiful defeat. For no ink can contain feelings, and no rules can save you from the love you forbade yourself. The rain against the high, arched windows of the ancient runes classroom did not tap. It drummed, a rhythmic, relentless percussion that seemed to enclose the stone room in a world of its own. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of afternoon where the castle felt less like a fortress and more like a slumbering beast, breathing heavy draughts of cold air through the corridors. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of melting beeswax, old parchment, and the faint, dusty dryness of chalk. Hermione Granger dipped her quill into her inkpot, the scratch of the nib against her parchment, the only sound competing with Professor Babbling's monotonous lecture on the instability of the Sewilo rune when inverted. She was focused, or at least she was trying to be. Her notes were precise, her posture perfect, but her attention kept drifting, pulled by an invisible thread toward the desk diagonally in front of her. Draco Malfoy was fidgeting. It was a subtle thing, perhaps unnoticeable to anyone who hadn't spent the last 7 years tracking him as a threat, a rival, or a puzzle. But to Hermione, who had mapped the geography of his arrogance and his malice since she was 11, this new 8th-year version of Malfoy was a study in repressed kinetic energy. He wasn't sneering. He wasn't lounging with that practiced aristocratic indolence that used to make her blood boil. Instead, he was vibrating with a strange, contained nervousness. His left hand, resting on the scarred wood of the desk, was tapping a silent rhythm. His shoulders, usually set in a rigid line of pure-blood entitlement, were hunched slightly, as if he were protecting something in his chest. Every few minutes, he would run a hand through his hair. Platinum strands that were usually gelled into submission now looked soft, almost disheveled, falling into his eyes in a way that was distractingly human. Hermione frowned at the back of his head. He had been like this for weeks, jumpy, avoiding eye contact, prone to sudden silences when he entered a room. The war was over, the trials were done, and they had all returned to Hogwarts to mend what was broken. Yet Malfoy seemed to be fracturing in slow motion. "Dismissed," Professor Babbling said, clapping her chalk-dusted hands together, snapping the spell of the drowsy afternoon. "And please, do remember that the essay on intentionality in runic scripts is due Thursday. Not Friday. Thursday." The room erupted into the scraping of chairs and the rustle of bags. Hermione carefully corked her ink, blowing gently on her parchment to dry the last sentence. She took her time. She always did. There was a certain peace in the ritual of organization, of slotting quills into cases and books into bags. She watched as Malfoy practically bolted from his seat. He didn't even look at the board to check the homework assignment. He shoved his textbook into his satchel with a chaotic urgency that was entirely un-Malfoy-like, swung the strap over his shoulder, and strode toward the heavy oak door without a backward glance. "Someone's in a hurry," Neville Longbottom muttered from the desk beside her, wrestling a heavy adventurous plant textbook into his bag. "Think he's got a date?" Hermione scoffed softly, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Malfoy, a date? I think it's more likely he's running from a hex he accidentally triggered. Or perhaps he just realized he's wearing mismatched socks." Neville chuckled and headed out, leaving Hermione as one of the last few students in the room. The classroom was emptying rapidly, the noise fading into the corridor. She stood up, smoothing the front of her skirt, and prepared to leave. That was when she saw it. It was sitting on the corner of the desk Malfoy had just vacated. It was unobtrusive, blending in with the dark wood, but unmistakably out of place. A small, black notebook. It wasn't a standard-issue Hogwarts exercise book. The binding was expensive, supple leather that looked soft to the touch, with silver corners that caught the dim light of the floating candles. Hermione paused. The ethical thing to do was to leave it, or perhaps turn it in to Professor Babbling. But Babbling had already disappeared into her office. Curiosity, that old, dangerous friend, nudged her forward. She walked over to the desk. The air around where Malfoy had been sitting still held the faint, crisp scent he carried, something like expensive soap, cedar, and rain. She reached out and picked up the book. It was warm. Malfoy, she sighed, shaking her head. Honestly, he couldn't have gone far. If she hurried, she could catch him in the corridor and hand it back with a suitably superior expression about responsibility and mindfulness. She turned the book over in her hands. There was no name on the cover, no house crest, no initials. It was sleek, private, and anonymous. She meant to just run after him. She really did. But the leather felt strange in her hand, personal. It didn't feel like a compilation of notes on ancient runes. It felt heavy. Without really making a conscious decision to pry, her thumb brushed the edge of the cover. It fell open to the first page. Hermione froze. There was no property of Draco Malfoy written in sweeping calligraphy. There were no doodles of snitches or potions ingredients. Instead, in the center of the creamy, high-quality paper, a single word was written in sharp, jagged black ink. The letters were pressed down hard, as if written in a moment of intense determination. Rules. Underneath it, in smaller, slightly shakier script, was a subtitle. Strict Guidelines for Survival. Year 8. Hermione blinked. A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty castle swept over her. Rules? What kind of rules? Was this some sort of dark magic binding contract? A list of pure-blood etiquette he was forcing himself to adhere to in a post-war world? She looked up at the door. The corridor was empty. The silence of the classroom pressed in on her. She should close it. She should run down the hall, shove it into his chest, and forget she ever saw it. But she looked down again. The first page was just the title. It was the tab sticking out slightly further down that caught her eye. Her fingers twitched. It was a terrible breach of privacy. It was wrong. It was something Harry or Ron would do without thinking. But she was Hermione Granger. She respected boundaries, usually. But Malfoy had been acting so strange, so volatile. What if this was something dangerous? What if he was planning something? It was practically her duty as head girl to ensure the safety of the school, wasn't it? Just one peek, she whispered to the empty room, to make sure it's not dark. She flipped the page. The handwriting inside was unmistakably Draco's, elegant, pointed, but hurried. There were crossed-out lines, blots of ink where the quill had rested too long, and frantic underlinings. It looked less like a diary and more like the ravings of a man trying to keep his sanity by tethering it to paper. Her eyes scanned the first entry, expecting a plot, a scheme, or a list of enemies. Rule number 1, do not look at her for more than 3 seconds. Hermione's brow furrowed. Her? Who was her? Pansy, Astoria, Professor McGonagall? She read the parentheses scrawled beneath the rule. Count to 3 inside your head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Then look at the floor. The floor is safe. The floor does not have golden flecks in its eyes. The floor is your friend. Hermione's breath hitched. She stared at the words, her mind racing. Golden flecks. She moved to the next one. Rule number 2. Do not sit within smelling distance of the Amitentia during potions. You know what you smell. Everyone knows what you smell. If Slughorn asks you to describe it, fake a coughing fit. Die if necessary. Do not say parchment and vanilla. Do not. Hermione's hand went to her throat. She wore vanilla perfume. She had worn it since 4th year. It was a subtle scent, mixed with the smell of old books that clung to her robes from her hours in the library. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a mirror of the rain outside. This couldn't be. This was absurd. This was Draco Malfoy. He hated her. He had spent years tormenting her. Even this year, in the quiet truce of the post-war world, he treated her with a cold, distant politeness that bordered on avoidance. Avoidance. Rule number 1. Do not look at her. She turned the page, her fingers trembling slightly. Rule number 5. When she raises her hand in transfiguration, do not sigh. Do not roll your eyes. And for the love of Salazar, do not stare at the ink stain on her finger. It is just ink. It is not charming. It is messy. You hate messy. Remember, you hate messy. You are a Malfoy. You require order. She is chaos wrapped in Gryffindor wool. Hermione looked down at her right hand. There, on the side of her middle finger, was a smudge of black ink from where she had been gripping her quill too tightly during Babbling's lecture. She felt a flush rising from her chest, heating her neck and cheeks. The classroom suddenly felt very small and very warm. This wasn't a list of dark plots. This wasn't a manifesto of blood purity. It was a containment strategy. She looked at the book again, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a dam holding back a flood. Every crossed-out word, every aggressive underline, every frantic command was a testament to a struggle she had been completely blind to. He wasn't avoiding her because he loathed her. He was avoiding her because he was terrified of this. Rule number 9. If she wears the blue jumper, leave the room immediately. Self-explanatory. Just go. Claim illness. Claim a summons from the ministry. Jump out the window if you must. Hermione let out a short, shocked laugh that sounded too loud in the quiet room. She was wearing the blue jumper today. It was an oversized knitted thing Mrs. Weasley had made, cozy and slightly shapeless, but she loved it because it was warm. She thought back to lunch. She had walked into the great hall wearing this jumper. Malfoy had been at the Slytherin table. He had looked up, seen her, turned an alarming shade of pale, and abruptly left the hall without finishing his soup. She had thought he was sick. She had even felt a momentary pang of sympathy for him. "Oh," she whispered, the realization settling over her like a heavy blanket. "Oh, Draco." She shouldn't read anymore. This was intimate. This was the raw, unpolished interior of a person she had considered an enemy for most of her life. It was a violation of the highest order. She closed the book with a snap. The sound echoed like a gunshot. She stood there, clutching the leather volume to her chest, her mind reeling. The world had shifted on its axis in the span of 3 minutes. The Draco Malfoy who sneered and looked down his nose was gone, replaced by the author of this frantic, desperate little book. A boy who counted to 3 to stop himself from looking at her. A boy who thought the floor was his friend because it didn't have her eyes. She looked at the door again. He was out there somewhere, likely realizing by now that his lifeline, his manual for survival, was missing. A slow, mischievous smile began to tug at the corner of Hermione's mouth. It was a dangerous smile, one that usually preceded a very complicated piece of magic or a very risky plan. She could give it back immediately. She could run and find him and hand it over, pretending she had never opened it. That would be the kind Gryffindor thing to do. But then she remembered rule number 7, which she had glimpsed just before closing the book. Rule number 7. Do not argue with her unless fully prepared. You will lose and you will look stupid. Just nod. Even if she says the moon is made of cheese, nod. The smile on her face widened. The tension that usually knotted her shoulders when she thought about Malfoy, the defensiveness, the wariness, began to unravel, replaced by something lighter, something bubbling and golden. He was terrified of her. The great Draco Malfoy, Prince of Slytherin, was walking on eggshells, trying not to notice the way she chewed her quill. She slipped the notebook into her bag, tucking it securely between her charms textbook and her pouch of dried herbs. She would return it. Of course, she would return it. She wasn't a thief. But perhaps not just yet. After all, she reasoned, swinging her bag onto her shoulder and heading toward the door with a spring in her step, it was important to be thorough. If she was going to return it, she needed to know exactly what rules she was inadvertently helping him break. It was practically a sociological study. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the drafty corridor. The torches were lit, casting long, flickering shadows on the stone walls. Far down the hallway, near the moving staircase, she saw a figure. It was Draco. He was patting his pockets frantically. He checked his robes, then his satchel. He spun around, scanning the floor, his face a mask of rising panic. He looked pale, his eyes wide and darting. He looked like a man who had just realized he had left the keys to the kingdom in the hands of the enemy. Hermione stopped. She stood in the shadows of the doorway, unseen. She watched him retrace his steps, running a hand through his hair, messing it up even further. Count to 3, she thought, watching him. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. She didn't look away. Draco paused, as if he felt eyes on him. He turned slowly, looking down the corridor. Hermione stepped out of the shadows. She didn't wave. She didn't shout. She just walked calmly toward the Gryffindor Tower, her head held high, a small, secret smile playing on her lips. As she passed the corridor where he stood, she saw him stiffen. She saw his eyes lock onto her. She saw him count. 1, 2, 3. He jerked his gaze away, staring intently at a suit of armor, as if it were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. Hermione suppressed a giggle, clutching her bag tighter. This was going to be an interesting year. The rain had not let up by the time Hermione returned to her dormitory. If anything, the storm had intensified, battering the stone walls of Hogwarts with a ferocity that made the fire in the grate seem all the more precious. Her room, privilege of the head girl position was a sanctuary of warmth and silence, save for the crackle of applewood logs and the rhythmic purring of Crookshanks, who was curled up like a burnt orange comma on the rug. Hermione sat cross-legged on her four-poster bed, the curtains drawn slightly to create a cocoon of velvet and shadow. The leather-bound notebook lay open on her knees. It felt heavy, not in weight, but in significance. It was a tangible piece of someone's soul, specifically a soul she had spent years believing was made of ice and prejudice. She had made herself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, hot and strong, to steady her nerves. She took a sip, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer, and then set it aside on the nightstand. She took a deep breath, the scent of old paper rising to meet her, and turned the page past the initial shock of rule number 1. The book was a chaotic landscape of ink. It wasn't just a list, it was a war zone. Some entries were written in calm, precise calligraphy, likely drafted in the quiet of the morning. Others were scrawled in hasty, jagged lines, the quill clearly pressing hard enough to tear the paper, suggestive of a thought penned in the heat of a panic attack. She ran her finger down to rule number 4. Rule number 4, the Library Sanctuary Protocol. Under no circumstances are you to approach her table in the library. I don't care if the only copy of Moste Potente Potions is sitting right next to her elbow. You do not need the book that badly. You can fail the assignment. Father will be disappointed. Let him be disappointed. It is better than the alternative. Hermione frowned, leaning closer to the candlelight. The alternative? What was the alternative? She read the frantic scribbling beneath the main rule. The alternative is standing there like a lemon while she looks up with those narrowed, suspicious eyes. You will forget how to speak English. You will say something offensive about her ancestry just to fill the silence because you are a coward. She will look hurt. You will hate yourself for 3 days. Do not approach the table. Hermione's heart gave a strange, painful squeeze. She traced the words. You will hate yourself. The ink there was smudge-proof, but the letters looked heavy. She remembered an incident 2 weeks ago in the library. Malfoy had hovered near her section, his hand outstretched toward a shelf, before he had abruptly sneered, muttered something about shoddy Gryffindor selection, and stormed off. She had thought he was being his usual unpleasant self. Reading this, she realized he had been fleeing his own incompetence. He wasn't insulting her because he wanted to. He was insulting her because it was the only defense mechanism he had left against his own paralysis. She turned the page, the sound of the crisp paper loud in the quiet room. Rule number 12, the quill issue. Stop noticing the way she chews the end of her quill. It is a disgusting habit. It is unsanitary. It likely spreads germs. Think of the germs, Draco. Think of dragon pox. Think of anything but the way her teeth sink into the feather. Below this, in a different ink, clearly written days later. Update. I bought her a box of sugar quills and left them on her desk anonymously. She ate 3. Now she chews those instead. This has backfired. Now her mouth is blue. It is distracting in a different way. Abort mission. New rule. Do not look at her mouth. Hermione's hand flew to her lips. She remembered the sugar quills. They had appeared on her desk in charms last Tuesday. She had assumed they were from Ginny, or perhaps Harry, though Harry usually forgot things like snacks, unless he was hungry himself. She had spent the entire lesson happily sucking on a blue raspberry quill, totally oblivious to the fact that 2 rows behind her, Draco Malfoy had likely been undergoing a silent existential crisis. A laugh bubbled up in her throat, a genuine, incredulous sound. It was absurd. It was utterly, completely ridiculous. And yet, beneath the absurdity, there was something undeniably endearing about the effort he was putting into this. He was trying so hard to be indifferent and failing so spectacularly. She flipped a few more pages, bypassing a crossed-out section titled Reasons Why She Is Annoying, which contained only 2 bullet points. 1, she is always right, and 2, she knows she is always right, and landed on a page that was less frantic and more resigned. Rule number 21, the morning hare. It defies gravity, it defies logic. It is a physics anomaly. When she comes down to breakfast, it looks like she fought a pillow and the pillow lost. Do not make fun of it. Do not offer her sleek easies. You want to touch it. You want to know if it is soft or if it crackles with static magic. You are sick. Seek help. Hermione instinctively reached up to touch her hair, which was currently tied in a loose, messy bun. She had spent years being self-conscious about her hair, years trying to tame it, years enduring taunts from Slytherins about looking like a bush. And here was the Prince of Slytherin confessing to his private diary that he had to physically restrain himself from finding out if it was soft. She felt a flush rise on her cheeks, warmer than the fire could account for. The image of Malfoy, pointy, sharp-edged, tailored Malfoy, wanting to touch her hair was difficult to compute. It didn't fit the narrative she had written for them. But the more she read, the more the narrative rewrote itself. This wasn't just attraction. Attraction was simple. Boys looked at girls, boys wanted girls. This was an obsession born of repression. He was dissecting her, analyzing her every movement, her every habit, and cataloguing it as a danger to his well-being. He viewed her as a hazard, a radioactive isotope that he couldn't help but want to study, even as he wore a lead suit. She turned to a page that had been dog-eared. The writing here was jagged, the ink blotchy. Rule number 33. The sweater vest incident. She wore the grey sweater vest today, the one with the Gryffindor tie loose at the collar. She rolled up her sleeves. I saw her forearm. I saw the scar. The playfulness of the previous entries vanished instantly. The air in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Hermione stared at the word scar. I wanted to apologize. I stood there behind the gargoyle on the 2nd floor and I practiced saying it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I watched. I'm sorry I didn't do anything. I practiced until the words sounded like nothing. But I couldn't do it. I can't be the person who fixes it. I'm the person who broke it. Rule number 33. Do not look at her arm. If you look at her arm, you will remember the drawing room. If you remember the drawing room, you will break. And you cannot break here. Not in front of her. Hermione let out a shaky breath, her vision blurring slightly. She touched the faint, pale letters carved into her skin beneath her sleeve. Mudblood. She had always assumed Malfoy didn't care, that he had moved on, that the war was just a bad memory for him, an inconvenience to his social standing. She had never considered that he carried the ghosts of the manor with him, that they haunted him just as much as they haunted her. Perhaps more. She was the victim. She had the moral high ground, the support of her friends, the right to heal. He was the bystander, the accomplice by inaction, drowning in guilt he felt he had no right to express. The rules weren't just about a schoolboy crush. They were guardrails for a boy walking a tightrope over an abyss of shame. He fell in love with her, or something close to it, and that love was terrifying him because it forced him to confront everything he had been raised to hate and everything he had failed to prevent. She carefully turned the page, needing to leave the heaviness of rule number 33 behind, needing to find the lighter, neurotic Malfoy again. Rule number 34. Smiling. Do not smile when she is right. This is crucial. Today, in Transfiguration, she turned the hedgehog into a pincushion perfectly. The needles were color-coordinated with the hedgehog's quills. It was brilliant. I felt the corner of my mouth twitch. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until it bled. If I smile at her, she will think I am mocking her. Or worse, she will smile back. And if she smiles back, I am dead. I am deceased. Put me in the family crypt. Hermione let out a teary laugh, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The emotional whiplash was exhausting. One moment he was drowning in war guilt. The next he was terrified of a smile. She closed the book gently, keeping her finger between the pages to mark her spot. She looked around her room. It was the same room she had entered an hour ago, but it felt different. The shadows felt less lonely. The castle felt less cold. She thought of Draco as she had seen him in the corridor earlier, frantic, searching, patting his pockets. He wasn't scared of losing a notebook. He was scared of being seen. He was scared of the world knowing that the Malfoy heir, the boy of ice and silver, was actually a mess of anxiety who bought sugar quills and counted to 3 just to keep his heart from beating out of his chest. She slid off the bed and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The rain lashed against the glass, distorting the lights of the groundskeeper's hut in the distance. "You idiot," she whispered to the reflection in the glass, though she wasn't speaking to herself. She couldn't return the book yet, not tomorrow morning. If she gave it back now, he would panic. He would retreat behind his walls, mortified that she had seen his vulnerability. He would assume she was disgusted or mocking him. Number. He needed to know that the rules didn't matter. Or rather, he needed to know that breaking them wouldn't result in the catastrophe he feared. She needed to test the data. She needed to see the rules in action. She walked back to the bed and tucked the notebook under her pillow. It felt safe there, a secret kept between the linen and the mattress. A plan began to form in her mind, sharp and bright. If Draco Malfoy had a rule about not looking at her for more than 3 seconds, she was going to make sure that the 4th second was worth the risk. If he had a rule about not arguing, she was going to provoke him until he had no choice but to engage. She crawled under the duvet, pulling the heavy blankets up to her chin. For the first time in months, the knot of tension that usually resided in her stomach, the pressure of exams, the weight of the future, the lingering shadows of the war, seemed to loosen. She closed her eyes, and the last thing she saw before sleep took her was the image of Draco Malfoy sitting in the library, biting his cheek, terrified to smile. Tomorrow, she decided, drifting off, she was going to wear the blue jumper again, just to see what would happen. The great hall was a cacophony of sound and smell, a sensory assault that usually Draco Malfoy found comforting in its predictability. The clatter of silver forks against porcelain, the roar of 1,000 simultaneous conversations, the heavy, savoury scent of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, and the sweet, cloying aroma of treacle tart. It was the rhythm of Hogwarts. But tonight, to Draco, it felt less like a dining hall and more like the waiting room of a particularly sadistic tribunal. He sat at the edge of the Slytherin table, his spine rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench so tightly his knuckles had turned the colour of fresh parchment. The notebook was gone. He had checked his satchel 3 times. He had checked his robe pockets. He had checked the floor under the table, surreptitiously kicking at the empty space with his polished Oxford, hoping to hear the slide of leather across stone. Nothing. He had cast a silent, desperate Accio under his breath while pretending to cough into his napkin. Nothing. The black, leather-bound compendium of his own neuroses, the detailed map of his pathetic, unrequited, and frankly embarrassing obsession with the head girl, was missing. Draco, are you going to eat that potato, or are you just going to stare at it until it admits defeat? Pansy Parkinson's voice cut through the fog of his panic. She was leaning on her elbow, watching him with a mixture of boredom and concern. Draco blinked, the roasted potato on his plate coming into sharp focus. It looked judgmental. "I'm not hungry," he clipped out, his voice sounding tight, like a violin string stretched to the breaking point. "You haven't eaten since breakfast," Blaise Zabini pointed out from across the table, swirling his goblet of pumpkin juice with an elegant flick of his wrist. "You're vibrating. Again. Did you forget to take your calming draft? Or is this just the Tuesday existential dread setting in?" "I am not vibrating," Draco lied. He released the bench, only to immediately pick up his fork and start tapping it against the table in a manic rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. "Right," Blaise drawled. "And I'm the King of Sweden. What did you lose?" Draco froze. "I didn't lose anything." "You're checking your pockets every 30 seconds, Pansy noted, taking a bite of a bread roll. "And you have that look. The, 'my father will hear about this' look, but without the father part. It's more of a, 'I am going to vomit my internal organs' look." "It's nothing," Draco hissed, lowering his voice. He scanned the room, his grey eyes darting from table to table. "Just a homework assignment. For babbling. Runes." "Runes?" Pansy raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you care about runes? You speak French. You said runes were for people who like drawing sticks." Draco ignored her. He was busy profiling the suspects. Who had it? Who could have picked it up? He had left runes in a hurry because he had felt the onset of rule number 11. Do not breathe too loudly when she is concentrating. It is creepy. And he needed to get to fresh air. He must have left it on the desk. So, who was left in the room? Longbottom, the plant enthusiast. Draco narrowed his eyes at the Gryffindor table. Neville was laughing at something Finnegan was saying, a piece of broccoli stuck to his tooth. Longbottom wouldn't take it. He was too noble. If he found it, he'd probably turn it into the lost and found, which was arguably worse, because Filch would read it. If Filch read rule number 21 about the hair texture, Draco would have to move to Antarctica. Who else? Weasley? No. Weasley had been in the hospital wing with a boil hex. Potter. Potter was currently trying to balance a spoon on his nose. Unlikely. Draco's gaze swept the room, searching for the small black book. Maybe someone was reading it right now. Maybe someone was laughing. Maybe the entire school already knew that Draco Malfoy, former Death Eater and heir to the Malfoy fortune, had a written protocol for how to survive sitting next to Hermione Granger without confessing his undying adoration. And then the heavy oak doors of the great hall creaked open. The noise in the hall didn't stop, but for Draco, the sound dropped out completely, replaced by the rushing of blood in his ears. Hermione Granger walked in, and she was wearing the jumper. Rule number 9. Draco's brain screamed, reciting the text he no longer possessed. If she wears the blue jumper, leave the room immediately. Self-explanatory. Just go. It was the blue knitted thing, the one that was too big for her, the one with the sleeves that covered half her hands, leaving only her fingertips visible. It was soft-looking. It was devastatingly domestic. It made her look like something you would find in a cottage in a storybook, reading by a fire. It was the antithesis of the dark, cold manner he had grown up in. It was a weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at his sanity. She stood in the doorway for a moment, shaking the rain from her umbrella. Her hair was wild, frizzy from the humidity, a halo of brown curls that caught the candlelight. Rule number 21, his mind supplied unhelpfully. The morning hair. Do not stare. Do not want to touch. He was staring. He was definitely staring. She handed the umbrella to a first year and began to walk down the center aisle toward the Gryffindor table. She looked happy. There was a lightness to her step. She wasn't carrying her usual stack of books. Her bag swung loosely at her hip. Wait, her bag. Draco's eyes locked onto the leather satchel bouncing against her side. Was it bulgier than usual? Was there a rectangular outline pressing against the canvas? He leaned forward, squinting. As if sensing his gaze, Hermione stopped. She was halfway to her table. She turned her head, her eyes seeking him out across the crowded hall with unnerving precision. Draco's breath hitched. He prepared to look away. He started the count. 1 Mississippi. She looked at him. Her expression was unreadable. It wasn't the usual suspicion or the polite indifference. It was amusement. 2 Mississippi. She reached up and brushed a curl behind her ear. The sleeve of the blue jumper slipped down, revealing her wrist. Draco felt his mouth go dry. 3 Mississippi. Look at the floor. Look at the floor. The floor is safe. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed. She held his gaze for a 4th second, then a 5th, and then the corner of her mouth quirked up. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't a sneer. It was a small, knowing, secret smile. She turned away and sat down next to Potter, pulling a plate of toast toward her with a casual grace that made Draco want to bang his head against the table. "Draco?" Pansy asked, sounding genuinely alarmed now. "You've gone grey, greyer than usual. You look like the bloody Baron." "I have to go," Draco mumbled, standing up abruptly. "You haven't eaten," Blay protested. "I'm not hungry. I have a potion brewing, a complex one, very volatile." He reached for his goblet of pumpkin juice to take a sip of courage before his retreat, his hand shaking. His fingers brushed the cold metal, but his coordination was shot. He clipped the rim. The goblet tipped. In slow motion, Draco watched the orange liquid cascade across the pristine white tablecloth. It soaked into the bread rolls. It splashed onto his trousers. It dripped onto the stone floor with a humiliating splat. Silence rippled outward from the splash zone. Several Slytherins looked at him in horror. A few Ravenclaws turned around. Draco froze, his hand hovering over the disaster. This was it. This was the bottom. He was Draco Malfoy. He was poised. He was elegant. And he had just spilt juice on himself like a toddling first year because Hermione Granger wore a blue jumper and smiled at him. He looked up, terrified, toward the Gryffindor table. Hermione was watching. She had a teacup raised to her lips. She saw the juice. She saw the stains spreading on his trousers. Any other day he would have expected a look of pity, or perhaps a roll of the eyes at his clumsiness. But she didn't roll her eyes. She hid her mouth behind her teacup, her shoulders shaking slightly. She was laughing, but it didn't look malicious. Her eyes were crinkled at the corners. It looked fond. She lowered the cup slightly, caught his eye again, and tapped the side of her own head, just once. "Think, Malfoy," the gesture seemed to say. Or maybe, "Relax." Draco stood there, dripping pumpkin juice, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. She had it. The realization hit him with the force of a bludger. She had the book. She had to. The look, the smile, the timing. She had found it in runes. She had read it. She knew. She knew about the 3-second rule. She knew about the jumper. She knew about the sugar quills. She knew he was a mess. Internal alarms blared in his mind. Evacuate. Abort. Flee to France. Change your name to Pierre and become a goat farmer. "Draco, mate," Blaise said, vanishing the mess with a flick of his wand. "Sit down. You're making a scene." "I can't sit down," Draco whispered, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "She knows." "Who knows what?" Pansy asked, reapplying her lipstick. "If this is about Granger, I swear to Morgana." "She has my rules," Draco said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Pansy paused, lipstick hovering mid-air. "Your rules?" "I have to get it back," Draco said, ignoring her. A strange manic determination began to replace the panic. It was a reckless, Gryffindorish kind of feeling. If she had read it, the damage was done. The secrets were out. He had nothing left to lose but his dignity, and that was currently soaking into his trousers in the form of pumpkin juice. He grabbed his bag. "Where are you going?" Blaise asked. "To the library," Draco said, slinging the strap over his shoulder. "She always goes to the library after dinner on Tuesdays. She has a routine." "You know her schedule?" Pansy asked, looking disturbed. "I know everything," Draco snapped, and then immediately regretted it. I observe. For strategic purposes." He turned and marched out of the Great Hall. He didn't look back at the Gryffindor table. He didn't need to. He could feel her gaze on his back, heavy and warm. He needed a plan. He needed a strategy. But all his strategies were in the book she was currently holding hostage. He walked into the cool, drafty corridor, the noise of the Great Hall fading behind him. The rain was still pounding against the windows, echoing the chaos in his head. He stopped by a suit of armor, leaning his forehead against the cold metal breastplate. "Okay," he muttered to himself. "Okay, she has the book. She hasn't hexed you. She hasn't turned you into a ferret." She smiled. He replayed the smile in his mind. It wasn't a predator's smile. It was the smile she used when she got an O on an essay she thought she had failed. It was relief, amusement. He took a deep breath, smelling the damp stone and the lingering scent of dinner. If she wanted to play, he would play. He had no choice. He was disarmed, exposed, and utterly at her mercy. But as he pushed off the wall and headed toward the grand staircase, a terrifying thought occurred to him. What if she expected him to break the rules? Rule number 7. Do not argue with her unless fully prepared. He wasn't prepared. He was never prepared. But for the first time in his life, walking toward the lion's den, Draco Malfoy realized that losing might not actually be the worst thing that could happen to him. The worst thing would be if she gave the book back without saying a word. If she handed it over with polite indifference and never looked at him again. That thought chilled him more than the pumpkin juice on his leg. He quickened his pace. He had to find her. He had to know. From the shadows of the landing above, Hermione Granger watched the blonde head disappear around the corner toward the library. She adjusted the heavy bag on her shoulder, feeling the sharp corner of the notebook pressing against her hip. She waited until he was gone, then descended the stairs, the blue jumper warm against her skin. She wasn't going to the library. Not yet. Let him sweat a little longer. Let him wonder. Besides, she had an entry to reread. Something about rule number 15 and the way she pronounced Wingardium Leviosa. She hummed a soft tune under her breath and turned toward the Gryffindor common room. The game was afoot, and for the first time in 8th year, Hermione Granger was having fun. The library at 8 o'clock in the evening was usually a sanctuary. It was a cathedral of silence, smelling of dust, binding glue, and the faint, sweet decay of aging paper. For Draco Malfoy, it had been the only place in the castle where the noise of his own thoughts didn't echo quite so loudly. He had chosen a table in the furthest corner of the restricted section, hidden behind a towering stack of encyclopedias on venomous tentacula and a precarious pile of arithmancy charts. It was a fortress. It was a bunker. Tonight, however, it felt like a trap. Draco sat with his back to the wall, a strategic necessity ingrained in him since 6th year, and stared blindly at the text in front of him. The words on the page were swimming. He had read the same paragraph about the toxicity of manticore venom 4 times, and he still couldn't tell you if it killed you instantly or just made you turn purple. His leg was bouncing under the table. Tap, tap, tap. He had fled the great hall with the intention of finding the notebook, but the moment he had stepped into the library, his courage had evaporated. If Hermione was here, confronting her meant admitting the book was his. Admitting the book was his meant admitting the contents were true. Admitting the contents were true meant stripping himself bare in front of the one person whose opinion had the power to flay him alive. So, he hid. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. He told himself he was strategizing. In reality, he was hyper-aware of every sound in the vast room. The scratching of a quill 3 aisles over sounded like a thunderclap. The rustle of Madame Pince's robes near the entrance was a threat. The rain battering the high, dark windows was a relentless drumbeat counting down to his execution. "She's going to come," a voice in his head whispered. "She always comes here on Tuesdays. You wrote it down. Rule number 4. He squeezed his eyes shut. Rule number 4. The library sanctuary protocol. It stated clearly that they were to exist in parallel universes within this room. She took the tables near the charm section. He took the dark corners. They did not intersect. It was a treaty signed in silence and maintained by his cowardice. The heavy double doors of the library creaked open. Draco's eyes snapped open. He stopped breathing. The footsteps were soft, muffled by the thick carpet, but he knew the cadence. Quick, purposeful, but light. Not the heavy plod of crab or goyle, rest their souls or lack thereof. Not the shuffling of a first year. He hunched lower over his book, pulling the collar of his robes up as if it could shield him from detection. Don't look up. If you don't look up, she isn't there. Object permanence is a lie. The footsteps drew closer. They didn't head toward the charms section. They were weaving through the stacks. They were coming toward the back. Draco's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. She knows. She's hunting. The footsteps stopped. Draco stared at the illustration of a manticore, willing the beast to jump off the page and eat him. A chair scraped against the floorboards. It wasn't a chair at a neighboring table. It was the chair directly across from him. The chair on the other side of his table. Draco froze. The air in the narrow aisle seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sheer impossibility of the moment. No one sat with him. No one. Even Blaze and Pansy knew that Library Draco was a volatile creature best left undisturbed. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his gaze. First, he saw the hands. Small, ink-stained, placing a heavy canvas bag on the table with a deliberate thump. Then, the sleeves. The blue wool. The accursed, cozy, grandmother-knitted blue wool that had caused his meltdown in the Great Hall. Then, the face. Hermione Granger was sitting opposite him. She wasn't glaring. She wasn't holding up his notebook like a trophy of war. She was simply arranging her things. She pulled out a roll of parchment, a bottle of ink, and a menacingly large textbook on advanced transfiguration. She acted as if sitting across from Draco Malfoy, Death Eater, pariah, nemesis, was the most natural thing in the world. Draco's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His brain was frantically flipping through the mental index of his rules, searching for a protocol for this specific scenario. Rule number 1, do not look at her for more than 3 seconds. Rule number 4, sanctuary protocol, breached. Rule number 9, the blue jumper, active danger. There was no rule for she invades your bunker and sets up camp. Hermione uncorked her ink bottle. The smell of the ink drifted across the table, mixing with the scent of vanilla and rain. It was intoxicating. It was terrible. She looked up. Draco didn't look away fast enough. He was caught, snared. Her eyes were brown. That was the simple description he gave to people. Granger, brown eyes, bushy hair, annoying. But the rules had forced him to be honest, at least on paper. They weren't just brown. In the flickering light of the floating candles, they were a warm, shifting landscape of amber, whiskey, and honey. There were flecks of gold near the pupil that he had only noticed in 6th year during Slughorn's party, just before everything went to hell. She locked eyes with him. Tick. Draco's internal clock started automatically. It was a survival mechanism. 1 Mississippi. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. Her expression was calm, open, and terrifyingly perceptive. She was studying him, not like a book, but like a person. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a profound, unsettling curiosity. 2 Mississippi. He could see the pulse in her neck. He could see a stray curl falling over her forehead. He could see the way the candlelight reflected in her irises, making them look luminous. He felt a physical pull, a magnetic force dragging him across the table. He wanted to lean in. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask her if she had read it, and if she hated him, and if she knew that the blue jumper was actually his favorite color. 3 Mississippi. The alarm bells in his head began to shriek. Danger! Danger! Abort! You are staring. You are creeping her out. She sees you. She sees the want. She sees the broken parts. 4. He couldn't break it. He was paralyzed. The 3-second rule was a hard limit, a magical barrier he had erected to keep his heart safe, and he was crashing right through it. Hermione's lips parted slightly, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Was she going to speak? Was she going to laugh? The tension stretched between them, tight as a bowstring. The silence of the library amplified the moment, until it felt like the only thing existing in the universe was the space between their eyes. Then Hermione did something that wasn't in the rules. She tilted her head to the side, just a fraction, and her eyes softened. It wasn't a surrender, it was an invitation. Draco panicked. The sheer intensity of the connection became too much. It was like staring into the sun. He violently jerked his head to the left, his neck cracking audibly. He stared with wide, unseeing eyes at the bookshelf beside him. "Goblins!" he blurted out. The word hung in the air, nonsensical and loud. Hermione paused. He could feel her gaze still on the side of his face. He could feel the heat radiating from her. "Goblins," she repeated, her voice a low, smooth contralto that vibrated in his chest. "The rebellion," Draco stammered, his face burning. He was staring at a book titled Modern Magical History, but his eyes were focused on a speck of dust on the spine. Of 1612. Very fascinating. The sociological implications. He sounded like an idiot. He sounded like a man who had lost his mind. There was a pause, a beat of silence where Draco expected her to pack up and leave, or perhaps call St. Mungo's to have him committed. Instead, he heard a soft, scratchy sound, the sound of a quill on parchment. "Yes," Hermione said, her voice laced with a humor that made his toes curl. "Although I always found the 1752 rebellion more compelling. The use of guerrilla tactics was quite revolutionary." Draco risked a glance back at her. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was writing, her head bent over her parchment. But there was a small, victorious smile playing on her lips. She knew what she had done. She had tested the perimeter. She had walked right up to the electric fence of his neuroses and poked it with a stick just to see if it sparked. And it had sparked. Oh, how it had sparked. Draco exhaled, a shaky breath that he tried to disguise as a sigh of boredom. He looked down at his own book. He hadn't absorbed a single word in the last 10 minutes. He was safe, technically. The eye contact was broken. The rule was re-established, albeit battered and bruised. But she didn't leave. She stayed there, scratching away at her essay, turning pages with crisp, efficient movements. Every time she moved, the scent of vanilla wafted over to him. Every time she dipped her quill, her hand came into his line of sight. She was dismantling his defenses simply by existing in his space. Draco tried to focus on the manticore again. Manticore's skin repels all known charms. "Draco?" He flinched. She used his first name. She never used his first name. It was always Malfoy, delivered with a crisp consonance, or you, delivered with disdain. Draco sounded soft. It sounded intimate. He looked up, wary. Rule number 1, reset. 1 Mississippi. Hermione wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her ink bottle. She seemed to be debating something. "I think," she said slowly, tracing the rim of the bottle with her quill, "that you're right about the floor." Draco blinked. "The floor?" She looked up then, meeting his eyes again. The impact was softer this time, but no less devastating. "The floor," she repeated, a playful glint in her golden eyes. "It's safe, reliable, but—" She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's terribly boring to look at, isn't it?" Draco's heart stopped, then restarted at double speed. She was quoting the rules. She was quoting the parentheses of the rules. Rule number 1. The floor is safe. The floor is your friend. She had read it. There was no doubt now. She had read the entry about her eyes. She knew he spent his time staring at the floor to avoid falling into them. And she was telling him, in the most Gryffindor way possible, that she didn't want him to look at the floor. Draco opened his mouth to deny it, to feign ignorance, to run away. But he couldn't move. He was pinned by the amusement and the challenge in her gaze. He started, his voice rough. "I suppose the floor has its merits. Stability, lack of distraction." Hermione hummed a thoughtful sound. "Distractions can be educational," she said. "If one is brave enough to face them." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. 1, 2, 3. Draco didn't look away. He couldn't. He was drowning, and for the first time he didn't want to swim to shore. "Point taken," he whispered. Hermione smiled, a full, genuine smile that lit up the dim corner of the library, and went back to her essay. Draco sat there, stunned, his blood singing in his veins. He looked at the manticore illustration. The manticore looked back, seemingly less threatening than the witch across the table. He didn't leave. He didn't invoke rule number 9. Instead, Draco Malfoy picked up his quill, dipped it into his ink, and for the first time in months, he wrote a sentence on his parchment that wasn't a rule. The toxicity of manticore venom is irrelevant if one has already been poisoned by something sweeter. He looked at the sentence, panicked, and immediately scratched it out until the parchment tore. Across the table, Hermione Granger didn't look up, but he saw her shoulders shake with silent laughter. The notebook was still missing. The secrets were out. The barrier was breached, and the air between them was crackling with a terrifying, wonderful electricity. Draco leaned back in his chair, watching her write. He didn't count the seconds anymore. He just watched. And he realized, with a jolt of terror and exhilaration, that he was already breaking every single rule he had written. The dungeons were always cold, a creeping, stone-deep chill that no amount of warming charms could truly banish. But on Thursday morning, the potions classroom felt stiflingly hot. The air was thick with the heavy, cloying scent of valerian roots and the acrid bite of salamander blood. 20 cauldrons bubbled in a discordant symphony of hisses and pops, creating a humidity that made robes stick to backs and hair frizz into halos. Draco Malfoy stood at his workstation, meticulously crushing scarab beetles with a silver mortar and pestle. He was focused. He was disciplined. He was a statue of pure blood efficiency. Inside, he was screaming. He hadn't slept. Not really. After the incident in the library, the incident capitalized, wherein Hermione Granger had looked him in the eye, quoted his own diary back to him, and then smiled. Draco had spent the night staring at the canopy of his bed, replaying the moment on a loop. She knew. She had the book. She had read the rules. And yet, the world hadn't ended. The auras hadn't come to arrest him for being a stalker. The sky hadn't fallen. Instead, she had flirted? Was it flirting? Or was it psychological warfare? With Granger, the line was often blurry. Now she was standing 3 feet away from him. They were sharing a long workbench, separated only by a precarious stack of ingredients and the invisible, electrified fence of Draco's anxiety. Rule number 7, Draco chanted mentally, grinding a beetle into dust with unnecessary violence. Do not argue with her unless fully prepared. You will lose. You will look stupid. Just nod. Passive resistance. He had written that rule after a disastrous debate in Charms 2 weeks ago regarding the ethics of memory charms, where she had dismantled his argument with 3 historical precedents and a quote from a goblin philosopher he'd never heard of. He had stuttered. He had blushed. He had wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Never again. The textbook is wrong. Hermione's voice cut through the bubbling noise of the room. Draco froze. He didn't look up. He stared at his beetle dust. Don't engage. It's a trap. Did you hear me, Malfoy? She moved closer. He could feel the warmth of her presence, smell the faint vanilla scent that seemed to cut through the dungeon gloom. Draco cleared his throat, keeping his eyes on his cauldron. I heard you, Granger. The instructions for the draft of peace, she continued, her voice crisp and authoritative, the tone she used when she was about to lecture a professor. It says to add the moonstone powder before the syrup of hellebore, but that's inefficient. If you add the syrup first, it stabilizes the base, allowing for a smoother integration of the moonstone. Draco's hand twitched on the pestle. She was wrong. She was brilliantly, confidently, catastrophically wrong. If you added the syrup first, the viscosity would be too high. The moonstone powder wouldn't dissolve. It would clump. The potion wouldn't turn turquoise. It would turn a murky grey and emit a smoke that smelled like wet dog. It was a classic amateur mistake, one that Snape would have deducted 50 points for. Draco opened his mouth to correct her. The retort was there, sitting on his tongue, sharp and ready. Actually, Granger, unless you want to brew sludge, the thermal reaction requires the powder to act as a catalyst. Then he remembered the notebook. He remembered rule number 7. Do not argue. You will lose. She was the brightest witch of her age. If she said the sky was green, he was supposed to buy emerald sunglasses. If he argued, she would probably pull out some obscure research paper from 1894 that proved she was right, and he would look like an arrogant fool. Again. He shut his mouth. He took a deep breath. He forced his facial muscles into a mask of polite agreement. I'm sure you're right, Draco said, his voice flat. Sounds plausible. He saw her pause out of the corner of his eye. She was chopping ginger roots, but her knife had stopped mid-air. Plausible, she repeated, her tone skeptical. Yes, Draco said, dumping his beetle dust into his cauldron. You're usually right about these things. Proceed. He felt a perverse sense of safety. He was following the rules. He was safe. The floor was his friend. Hermione set her knife down with a sharp clack. She turned fully toward him. The steam from her cauldron curled around her hair, making her look like a tempestuous spirit. You don't agree with me, she accused. Draco blinked, finally looking at her. Her eyes were narrowed, golden flecks burning with intelligence and annoyance. "I just said I did," Draco lied smoothly. "Syrup first. Revolutionary technique. Go ahead." "You're lying," she snapped. She took a step closer, invading his personal space. "I can see it in your face. You think I'm going to ruin the potion." "I think nothing of the sort," Draco said, retreating slightly until his back hit the edge of the stone table. "I have complete faith in your academic prowess." "Stop it," she hissed. It wasn't a malicious hiss, it was frustrated. "Stop patronizing me. Stop following the stupid rule." Draco's heart skipped a beat. The noise of the classroom seemed to fade away. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Rule number 7, Hermione whispered, her voice low enough that Slughorn wouldn't hear, but loud enough to ring in Draco's ears like a bell. "Do not argue with her unless fully prepared." That's what it says, isn't it? Draco felt the blood drain from his face. She was quoting it. She was quoting it verbatim in the middle of potions. He stammered. "You're not prepared," she said, her eyes searching his. "You're terrified. You think if you disagree with me, I'll... what? Bite you? Humiliate you?" "It's a possibility," Draco muttered, looking at her lips. Rule number 12. Do not look at her mouth. He looked at her chin instead. "I don't want you to agree with me, Draco," she said softly, the use of his name hitting him like a physical blow. "I want you to tell me what you think, even if you think I'm an idiot." "I don't think you're an idiot," he said quickly, honestly. "I think you're brilliant, which is why you're afraid to challenge me," she finished for him. She looked disappointed. That look broke something in him. The disappointment. He could handle her anger. He could handle her disdain. But he couldn't handle her looking at him like he was boring, like he was broken. A surge of the old Malfoy pride, the arrogance that had nothing to do with blood status and everything to do with being top of the class, flared up in his chest. "Fine," Draco snapped, his voice dropping an octave, becoming silkier, sharper. He leaned forward, matching her proximity. The tension between them shifted instantly from awkward to electric. "You're wrong," he said. Hermione's eyes widened, a spark of interest igniting. "Excuse me?" "The syrup," Draco said, gesturing dismissively at her ingredients. "If you add the hellebore syrup first, you'll increase the viscosity of the solution before the moonstone has a chance to dissolve. The thermal conductivity will drop. You won't get a draught of peace. You'll get a semi-solid sludge that will congeal at the bottom of the cauldron and take 3 days to scrub off." Hermione stared at him. Her lips parted. She didn't look angry. She looked exhilarated. "But," she countered, her voice breathless, "Gulpalot's third law states that the stabilizer can act as a suspension medium if the heat is high enough." Gulpalot was a theoretician who never brewed a decent potion in his life. Draco sneered elegantly, moving closer until he was looming over her. He saw the flush rising on her neck. "And unless you plan on raising the temperature of that cauldron to a point where it melts the pewter, your suspension theory is garbage. The moonstone needs a liquid base with low resistance to distribute the magic. Powder first. Always powder first." He stopped, breathing hard. He had done it. He had insulted her theory. He had called her idea garbage. He had broken rule number 7 into 1,000 pieces and danced on the ashes. He waited for the explosion. He waited for her to eviscerate him with logic. Instead, Hermione Granger smiled. It wasn't the polite smile from the library. It was a fierce, predatory, dazzling smile. Her eyes were shining. "There he is," she whispered. Draco blinked, confusion warring with the adrenalines in his blood. "What?" "There's the wizard who fixed the vanishing cabinet," she said softly. "There's the mind I've been missing." She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm for a split second before she pulled back, grabbing the jar of moonstone powder instead. "You're right," she said, her voice clear and carrying a note of submission that made Draco's knees weak. "Powder first. I defer to your expertise, Malfoy." She uncorked the jar and sprinkled the powder into her cauldron. It hissed perfectly, turning the potion a shimmering pale silver. Draco stood there, leaning against the table, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt dizzy. She had baited him. She had deliberately suggested a catastrophic brewing method just to force him to speak up. She had manipulated him into breaking his own rule because she wanted to argue with him. She wanted his opinion. She respected his intelligence enough to provoke it. He watched her stir the potion, her movements rhythmic and hypnotic. She looked up, catching his eye through the steam. "Update the rule, Draco," she murmured, a playful smirk dancing on her lips. "Argue with her. She likes it." Draco swallowed hard. The air in the dungeon felt suddenly charged, heavy with unspoken words, and a heat that had nothing to do with the fires beneath the cauldrons. He realized then that the diary wasn't just a list of his fears anymore. It was becoming a script, and she was rewriting the ending. "I'll consider it," he managed to say, his voice rough. "Good." She turned back to her potion, but he saw the satisfaction in the set of her shoulders. "And Draco?" "Yes?" "Don't look at the floor," she said, nodding toward his feet. "My eyes are up here." Draco looked up. He met her gaze. He held it. 1, 2, 3, 4. He didn't look away. And for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like a chasm. It felt like a bridge. 10 points to Slytherin, Slughorn boomed from the front of the room, oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred in the back row. "For an excellent textured base, Mr. Malfoy, and Miss Granger, wonderful stirring technique." Draco didn't hear him. He was too busy memorizing the way the candlelight caught the golden flecks in Hermione Granger's eyes, and wondering if there was a rule about how to stop himself from kissing her right there in front of the bubbling cauldrons and the pickled toads. He suspected that if he checked the book, that page would be blank. He was in uncharted territory now, and God help him, he didn't want to turn back. The storm that had been threatening the Scottish Highlands for 3 days finally broke on Friday afternoon. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a vertical ocean descending upon the castle. The sky was a bruised purple, bruised the colour of a healing hex, and the corridors of Hogwarts were filled with the relentless, hollow roar of water hammering against ancient stone. Draco Malfoy stood in the alcove of a window on the 4th floor, watching the deluge. The glass was cold against his forehead. He was supposed to be in the library, or the common room, or anywhere productive. But he was paralyzed by a strange, restless energy that felt like static electricity crawling under his skin. He was waiting. He wouldn't admit it to himself. That would violate at least 3 new rules he hadn't written down yet. But he was waiting for her. He knew her schedule. Arithmancy ended at 4. She would take the shortcut through the Gunhilda of Gorsmore corridor to get to the Gryffindor Tower. She would pass this spot. He told himself he just wanted to retrieve the book. It had been 4 days. The game was becoming dangerous. The look she had given him in potions, the challenge, the heat, the approval, had haunted his dreams. He needed the notebook back so he could burn it, bury the ashes, and then perhaps obliviate himself for good measure. Footsteps echoed on the stone floor. Not the heavy, clomping steps of students eager for dinner, but the brisk, determined pace he knew better than his own heartbeat. Draco straightened, adjusting his cuffs. He composed his face into a mask of bored indifference. He prepared to demand his property back. Then she rounded the corner. Draco's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, physical pain. She had clearly been caught outside, perhaps crossing the courtyard from the greenhouses. She was drenched. Her robes were heavy with water clinging to her frame, but it was her hair that stole the air from the corridor. Usually, Hermione Granger's hair was a manageable, if spirited, cloud of curls. Today, battling the humidity and the wind, it had expanded into something magnificent and terrifying. It was a wild, untamed mane, frizzing with static, defying gravity, framing her face like a lion's mane of damp, dark gold. She stopped when she saw him. She was breathing hard, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold rain and the exertion of running. A droplet of water trailed down her temple, tracing the line of her jaw before disappearing into the collar of her shirt. Draco stared. His mind, traitorous as always, immediately pulled up the file. Rule number 21. The morning hair. It defies gravity. It defies logic. Do not make fun of it. Do not offer her sleek-easies. You want to touch it. You want to know if it is soft or if it crackles with static magic. You are sick. Seek help. He stood there, frozen, his eyes wide. He wasn't sneering. He wasn't laughing. He was looking at her as if she were a force of nature that had just crashed into his world. Hermione didn't look away. She stood her ground, dripping wet, clutching her bag, his bag, effectively, to her chest. She saw his gaze travel up to the halo of chaotic curls. Any other year, she would have flushed crimson. She would have tried to smooth it down, muttering spells that never worked, shrinking under the weight of his judgment. She would have heard the word bushy in his voice, even if he didn't say it. But today, she just tilted her chin up. "It's the humidity," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a husky undertone to it, a vibration that matched the storm outside. Draco couldn't speak. The urge to touch was overwhelming. It wasn't a casual thought. It was a visceral need. His fingers twitched at his sides. He wanted to know. He needed to know if it was as soft as it looked, or if the electricity he felt in the air was actually coming from her. Rule number 21. Abort. Abort. Look at the floor. He forced his eyes down to her shoes. They were muddy. "You look," he started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again, striving for his usual drawl, but landing somewhere near desperate honesty. "You look like you fought the giant squid and lost." It was a weak insult. It lacked teeth. It was practically a compliment in Malfoy speak. Hermione let out a small, breathless laugh. She took a step closer. The smell of rain and ozone and wet wool hit him, the scent of the storm bound up in the girl. "I didn't lose," she said softly. "I'm just untamed today." The word hung in the air between them. Untamed. Draco looked back up at her face. Her eyes were searching his, stripping away the layers of defense he had spent years building. She wasn't self-conscious about her hair. She knew he wasn't mocking it. She had read the entry. She knew that his insults were just a cover for a fascination he couldn't control. "I see that," Draco whispered. He watched a curl spring back as she shifted her weight. It was mesmerizing. "The book says," Hermione began, stepping into his personal space, "that you think it defies physics." Draco flinched. Hearing her reference the book out loud in the open corridor was like having a layer of skin peeled back. "The book is a work of fiction," he rasped, backing up until his shoulder blades hit the stone wall. "Written by a madman." "The book says," she continued, ignoring his denial and moving closer still until she was only a foot away, "that you wonder if it crackles." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the gloom of the storm. She was daring him. She was offering him the answer to a question he had been too afraid to ask himself. Draco's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The air around them felt heavy, charged with magic that didn't need a wand. Draco swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Liar," she whispered. She didn't say it with malice. She said it with a terrifying tenderness. She reached up, not to fix her hair, but to tuck a stray, damp curl behind her ear. The movement was slow, deliberate. It drew his eye to the curve of her neck, to the pulse beating frantically beneath her skin. "Does it?" Draco asked. The words slipped out before he could stop them. He was breaking the rule. He was shattering it. Hermione lowered her hand. She looked at him, her expression open, vulnerable, and incredibly brave. "Find out," she breathed. The world stopped. The sound of the rain faded into a distant hum. There was only Draco and Hermione, and the space between his hand and her hair. He raised his hand. It was trembling. He looked at his own fingers as if they belonged to a stranger, pale, long, accustomed to gripping a wand or a quill, but never this, never her. He reached out. Hermione didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, just a fraction, closing the distance. She closed her eyes, trusting him. That trust terrified him more than the Dark Lord ever had. His fingers brushed the ends of her hair. It wasn't like wire. It wasn't like straw. It was incredibly, shockingly soft. It was cool from the rain, but beneath the dampness there was a warmth, a living texture that sent a shockwave up his arm. He let his fingers sink into the curls, just near her temple. Zap! A tiny static spark jumped from her hair to his fingertips. It wasn't painful. It was startling. It was real. "It crackles," he whispered, wonder coloring his voice. Hermione opened her eyes. They were dark, dilated, filled with a storm that matched the one outside. She looked at him with such intensity that Draco felt his knees weaken. His hand was still in her hair. He was touching Hermione Granger. He was breaking the laws of his universe, and the universe wasn't collapsing. It was expanding. "Draco," she murmured. Her voice was a caress. He looked at her lips. Rule number 12 lay in ruins at his feet. He wanted to kiss her. The desire was a physical ache, a hunger that had been starving in the dark for years. He wanted to tangle his hands in this impossible hair and pull her closer until the damp wool of her robes pressed against his chest. He leaned in. She tilted her head back. Her breath hitched. But then the sound of laughter echoed from the staircase below. Voices. Students coming up from the great hall. The spell shattered. Draco jerked his hand back as if he had been burned. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with panic. The reality of who they were, Malfoy and Granger, Slytherin and Gryffindor, the broken boy and the war heroine, crashed back down on him. He couldn't do this. Not here. Not like this. He was a mess. He was a collection of neuroses bound together by a stolen notebook. He wasn't ready to be the person she needed. He stammered, backing away. I have to go. Hermione blinked, the dazed look in her eyes replaced by a flicker of hurt, followed quickly by understanding. She didn't try to stop him. She didn't chase him. She just stood there, wild and beautiful and damp, clutching his secrets to her chest. You're running away again, Malfoy, she said softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. I'm not running, Draco lied, his voice hollow. I'm adhering to the guidelines. He turned and walked away, fast, his footsteps echoing sharply against the stone. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked back and saw her standing there, looking like a storm goddess who had just let a mortal touch the lightning, he would never be able to leave. He rounded the corner and slumped against the wall, his heart racing so fast it hurt. He raised his hand, the hand that had touched her, and stared at it. His fingertips were still tingling. He closed his eyes and let his head throb against the cold stone. He had touched her hair, and she had let him. The rules were useless. They were utterly, completely useless. Because no rule could account for the way she looked at him when he called her untamed. No rule could protect him from the realization that had just taken root in his chest. He wasn't just surviving Hermione Granger anymore. He was falling in love with her. And he was absolutely terrified that she might be falling for him too. Somewhere down the corridor, Hermione Granger stood alone in the shadows. She reached up and touched the spot where his fingers had rested. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She opened her bag and pulled out the black notebook. She turned to rule number 21. She found a quill in her pocket, uncorked it with her teeth, and wrote in the margin, the ink blurring slightly on the damp paper. Update. The static is mutual. She closed the book with a snap, the sound lost in the roar of the rain, and walked toward the Gryffindor Tower, her wild hair trailing behind her like a banner of war. The siege was almost over. The surrender was inevitable. The astronomy tower was the highest point in the castle, a lonely spire of stone that pierced the veil of the night sky. At midnight, it was a place of absolutes, absolute cold, absolute silence, and absolute vertigo. It was the only place Draco Malfoy felt he could breathe, largely because the air was so thin it forced his lungs to work for it. He stood by the crenellated ramparts, looking out over the forbidden forest. The storm from the previous day had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean, polished to a deep, bruising indigo, and scattered with a careless handful of stars. The wind was still biting, whipping his cloak around his legs and numbing his fingers, but he didn't cast a warming charm. The cold felt deserved. It felt real. It had been 24 hours since the incident in the corridor. 24 hours since he had touched her hair. 24 hours since he had fled like a coward, leaving Hermione Granger standing in the damp shadows with his dignity in her hands. He hadn't gone to dinner. He hadn't gone to breakfast. He had attended his classes in a haze of autopilot efficiency, sitting in the back, staring at the blackboard, and invoking a new, unwritten rule. Rule number 0: do not exist. If he didn't exist, he couldn't be embarrassed. If he didn't exist, he couldn't feel the phantom sensation of soft, static-charged curls against his fingertips. He gripped the rough stone of the parapet, his knuckles white. "You're pathetic," he told the darkness. The wind snatched the words away, tossing them down towards the black lake. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He knew she had the book. He knew she had read it. The way she had looked at him, the challenge in the library, the softness in the corridor. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. She knew everything. She knew about the panic attacks. She knew about the guilt. She knew about the obsession that had slowly, agonizingly transformed from hatred into something that felt dangerously like devotion. And yet, she hadn't exposed him. She hadn't pinned the pages to the Slytherin notice board. She hadn't laughed. That was almost worse. The silence was a vacuum, and Draco was imploding. Behind him, the heavy iron door of the tower groaned. Draco didn't turn around. He froze, his shoulders tensing. He knew who it was. He didn't need to see her to know. The air in the tower shifted, the pressure changing, as if the atmosphere itself was bowing to her arrival. A faint scent of vanilla and old parchment cut through the sharp, icy smell of the wind. Footsteps, soft, deliberate. Not the stalking steps of a predator, but the steady approach of someone who had no reason to hide. She stopped a few feet away. He could feel her presence at his back, a source of warmth in the freezing night. "It's cold up here, Malfoy," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the playful challenge she had worn in the library. It was just Hermione. Draco closed his eyes for a second, steeling himself. He turned around slowly. She was standing in the pool of silver moonlight that spilled through the archway. She was wearing her Gryffindor robes, wrapped tightly around her against the chill, her hands buried in her pockets. Her hair, the chaotic, magnificent entity that had been his undoing, was pulled back into a loose braid, though a few rebellious strands danced in the wind. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired, but her eyes were alert, watching him with that terrifyingly perceptive gaze that seemed to see right through his occlumency shields. "I like the cold," Draco said. His voice sounded rough, unused. "It keeps the mind sharp." "It freezes the brain," she corrected gently, stepping further onto the platform. "And you need your brain. It's one of your better features." Draco let out a short, humorless huff. "I'm sure the list of my better features is a very short document." Hermione tilted her head. "You'd be surprised." The wind howled around the tower, fluttering the hem of her robes. They stood there in silence for a moment, two ghosts on the ramparts of a castle that had seen too much war. Draco couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was clawing at his throat. "Why are you here, Granger?" he asked, though the bite in his tone was weak. "Did you come to gloat? Did you come to tell me that I'm a mess? Because I know. I have it written down, in extensive detail." He gestured vaguely to the space between them, acknowledging the elephant in the room, or rather, the missing book. Hermione didn't answer immediately. She watched him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she pulled one hand out of her pocket. She was holding it, the black leather notebook, his lifeline, his confession. Draco stopped breathing. Seeing it in her hand felt like seeing his own heart ripped out of his chest. It looked small, harmless, just a stack of paper, but it contained the coordinates of his soul. She took a step forward. Draco fought the urge to step back. He held his ground, though his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I didn't come to gloat," she said softly. "And I didn't come to tell you you're a mess." She held the book out to him. The distance between them was only an arm's length, but it felt like a canyon. Draco looked at the book, then at her face. "You read it," he stated. It wasn't a question. Hermione didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't offer a polite lie. She simply held his gaze, her eyes golden and steady in the moonlight. "I found it," she said. "I opened it, and once I started..." She trailed off, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I couldn't stop. It was compelling literature." Draco felt the blood rush to his face, heating his frozen cheeks. "It's a list of neuroses. It's not literature. It's a list of someone trying very hard to be better," she said firmly, "and trying very hard to survive." She took another step, closing the gap. She reached for his hand, his right hand, the one that hung limp at his side. She took it in hers. Her fingers were warm, shockingly warm against his ice-cold skin. She pressed the notebook into his palm. "You left this," she whispered. Draco's fingers curled around the leather binding automatically. The texture was familiar. It felt like coming home. But he didn't pull his hand away. He let her hold it there for a moment, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "How much?" Draco croaked. "How much did you read?" He needed to know the blast radius. He needed to know if she had seen rule number 33 about the scar. If she had seen the entry about how he hated the color green because it reminded him of the killing curse. If she had seen the parts where he admitted that he didn't think he deserved to be at Hogwarts at all. Hermione looked down at their joined hands. The moonlight caught the curve of her lashes. "Enough," she said quietly. "Enough to hate me." Hermione looked up sharply. The fierceness in her eyes took him by surprise. "No. Draco, no." The use of his name was a physical blow. "Then what?" he whispered. "Pity. Because I don't want your pity, Granger. I can take your anger. I can take your hexes. But don't you dare pity me." "It's not pity," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She squeezed his hand, pressing the book into his palm. "It's relief." Draco blinked. "Relief? I thought..." She hesitated, looking away toward the horizon where the stars met the dark line of the forest. "I thought you hated me. I thought you ignored me because you couldn't stand the sight of me. I thought the war had just solidified everything." She looked back at him, her eyes searching his. "To find out that you were just counting to 3. She let out a breathy laugh that sounded like a sob. "That you were scared of my hair? That you bought me sugar quills?" Draco groaned, dropping his forehead. "Please, forget the sugar quills." "Never," she teased gently. But then her face sobered. She stepped closer, so close that he could see the individual specks of gold in her irises. So close that rule number 1 was screaming in his head, but he silenced it. "Draco," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that the wind couldn't steal. "You don't have to follow the rules anymore." Draco looked at her. He felt unmoored, dizzy with the proximity and the sheer impossibility of her acceptance. "They keep me safe," he murmured. "They keep me from doing stupid things." "Like what?" she challenged softly. Like staring at you, he said. The truth slipped out, raw and unpolished. Like wanting to be near you. Like thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could be someone you don't despise. Hermione's expression softened into something that looked dangerously like affection. She reached up with her free hand, the one not sandwiching the book against his palm, and touched his cheek. Her fingers were light, tentative, tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "You failed," she whispered. Draco's breath hitched. "What?" "You failed at the rules," she said, a smile blooming on her face, radiant and kind. "You stared, you argued, you touched my hair, you broke every single one." "I know," Draco admitted, leaning involuntarily into her touch. "I'm terrible at this." "Thank goodness for that," she murmured. She stepped back slowly, her hand sliding from his cheek, then releasing his hand. The loss of contact was immediate and cold, but the warmth remained under his skin. She nodded at the book in his hand. "Read the last page," she said. Draco looked down at the notebook. He looked back at her, panic flaring again. "You wrote in it." "Just a small addendum," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Consider it peer review." She began to walk backward toward the heavy iron door, her gaze never leaving his. "Good night, Draco," she said. "Good night, Hermione," he whispered. It was the first time he had ever said her name aloud. It tasted like sugar and ozone. She smiled one last time, turned, and disappeared into the shadows of the stairwell. The heavy door groaned shut, leaving him alone on the tower. But he didn't feel alone. Draco stood there for a long time, the wind whipping his hair into his eyes. He looked at the book in his hand. It felt different now. It didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a conversation. His heart was beating a frantic, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. He moved toward one of the stone gargoyles, where a torch flickered in a sconce, casting a pool of warm orange light. His hands were trembling as he opened the leather cover. He flipped past the crossed-out rules about hair. He flipped past the frantic scribbles about potions. He flipped past the entries about guilt and shame. He reached the last page he had written on. A miserable entry from yesterday about being a coward. Below it, in neat, confident, familiar cursive, was a new entry. The ink was fresh, dark blue. Draco read it. Then he read it again. A sound escaped his throat. Half laugh, half sob. He traced the letters with his thumb, smudging the ink slightly. He looked up at the stars. The constellation Draco was winding its way around the North Star, bright and permanent. He wasn't drowning anymore. He had been thrown a lifeline, and it had come in the form of vandalism in his private diary. He clutched the book to his chest, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, Draco Malfoy smiled. A real smile, one that reached his eyes. He couldn't wait for tomorrow. He had a lot of rules to break. The Saturday morning sun hit the black lake at an angle that sent ripples of reflected light dancing across the ceiling of the Slytherin boys' dormitory. Usually, Draco Malfoy would have cursed the light, pulled the emerald velvet curtains of his four-poster bed tight, and wallowed in the gloom until noon. Today, however, he was awake before the sun. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed in his crisp black trousers and a white shirt that was pressed to perfection. His tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck. In his lap lay the black notebook. It looked innocuous. It looked like a simple vessel for homework assignments or potion recipes. But to Draco, it felt like a grenade that had detonated, leaving him standing in the wreckage, miraculously unharmed and strangely lighter. He ran his thumb over the edge of the paper, taking a deep breath to steady the fluttering in his chest. He turned to the last page again. He had read it on the astronomy tower by wandlight, and he had read it 3 times since waking up, just to ensure his mind hadn't fabricated the memory out of desperate wish fulfillment. It was still there. Hermione's handwriting, neat, looped, and unapologetically assertive, dominated the bottom half of the page, right below his own jagged scrawl about being a coward. Rule update. 1. You are permitted to smile when I am right. Given my track record, I suggest you start exercising your facial muscles immediately. 2. The floor is boring. Look at me instead. I promise not to count. 3. The blue jumper is currently in the laundry. You are safe for approximately 24 hours. Use them wisely. Draco stared at the words, a laugh bubbling up in his throat. It was cheeky. It was confident. It was so undeniably Granger that he could practically hear her voice dictating it, the tone hovering somewhere between a lecture and a caress. Safe for 24 hours, he murmured to the empty room, tracing the curve of the S in safe. He closed the book with a soft snap. He didn't hide it under his pillow this time. He didn't shove it into the bottom of his trunk. He placed it deliberately on his nightstand, next to his wand. It wasn't a secret shame anymore. It was a correspondence. He stood up, knotting his tie with practiced ease, catching his reflection in the tall mirror in the corner. He looked different. The shadows under his eyes seemed less pronounced. The tension that usually held his shoulders in a rigid line of defense had evaporated. He looked like a boy who had just realized that the monster in the closet was actually just a pile of laundry. Right, he said to the mirror, straightening his collar. Facial muscles. You can do this. He attempted a smile. It looked slightly manic. He relaxed his face. Work in progress, he decided, and headed for the door. The great hall was bright, bathed in the pale, clear light that follows a storm. The air smelled of toast, strong coffee, and the crisp freshness of autumn. The usual roar of breakfast conversation was in full swing, a comforting blanket of noise. Draco walked in. Normally, this was the part where the routine kicked in. Head down, eyes forward. Ignore the Gryffindor table. Don't look. Don't engage. Survive. Today, Draco stopped at the entrance. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't look at the Slytherin table. He looked directly at the center of the room. She was there. Hermione was sitting in her usual spot, flanked by Potter and Weasley. She was holding a piece of toast in one hand and gesticulating with it as she spoke, clearly explaining something of vital importance to a bewildered-looking Ron. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ribbon, tame compared to yesterday's storm-born mane, but a few curls had escaped to frame her face. She wasn't wearing the blue jumper. She was wearing her standard uniform, her tie slightly askew. As if feeling the weight of his gaze, or perhaps simply because she was looking for him too, she stopped talking. She turned her head. Their eyes met across the expanse of the hall. 1 Mississippi. Draco didn't look away. 2 Mississippi. He saw Potter glance at her, then follow her gaze to the door. He saw Weasley pause mid-chew. 3 Mississippi. Hermione didn't blink. A slow, tentative smile began to spread across her face. It started in her eyes, crinkling the corners, and moved down to her lips. It was an invitation, a question, Well, the smile seemed to say. Did you read it? Draco felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but for the first time, it wasn't shame. It was adrenaline. It was joy. He took a breath, ignored the confused look Blaise Zabini was shooting him from the side, and let his guard down. He smiled. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't a sneer. It was a genuine, lopsided, slightly terrified, but undeniably happy smile. He saw Hermione's eyes widen slightly, as if she hadn't actually expected him to do it. Then her smile deepened, turning radiant. She raised her piece of toast in a subtle salute. Draco dipped his head in acknowledgement, the gesture feeling ancient and courteous, a knight bowing to his queen. He walked to the Slytherin table and sat down. He poured himself a cup of pumpkin juice. His hand was steady. "You're in a good mood," Pansy Parkinson observed, eyeing him suspiciously over her copy of Witch Weekly. "It's unsettling. Did someone die?" "No," Draco said, buttering a scone with elaborate care. "Quite the opposite." "You smiled at Granger," Blay noted, his voice low. "I saw it. You looked at her, and you smiled. Are you under the Imperious curse? Blink twice if you need a rescue squad." Draco took a bite of his scone. It tasted fantastic. "No curse, Blaze. Just a rule update." "A what?" "Pass the marmalade," Draco said comfortably. The walk to ancient runes was usually a solitary affair for Draco, but today the corridors felt less like a labyrinth and more like a path. He lingered near the library, knowing the traffic patterns of the castle better than he knew the periodic table of elements. When she rounded the corner, clutching a stack of books, he was leaning against a tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy, waiting. Hermione slowed when she saw him. The students flowing around them seemed to part like a river around a stone, leaving them in a quiet eddy of the hallway. "Malfoy," she greeted, clutching her books tighter. Her cheeks were pink. "Granger," he replied. He pushed off the wall and fell into step beside her. It was a bold move, a public move, walking together, not fighting, not ignoring each other. "I see you got the memo," she said, keeping her eyes forward, though he could see the smile tugging at her lips. "Hard to miss," Draco drawled. "You have very distinctive handwriting, dominating. It takes up a lot of space." "I have a lot to say," she countered. "Evidently." Draco glanced at her profile. "I noticed the lack of blue wool today, following your own safety protocols." Hermione laughed, a bright sound that made a second-year Hufflepuff trip over his own robes as he passed them. "I thought I'd ease you into it. Withdrawal symptoms can be nasty if you go cold turkey, but shock is worse." "Thoughtful of you," Draco said. "I appreciate the mercy." They walked in silence for a few moments, the only sound the scuff of their shoes on the stone. It was a comfortable silence. The tension that had defined them for so long, the enemies part of the equation, was gone, replaced by a humming awareness. "So," Hermione said, stopping just outside the rune's classroom. She turned to face him, leaning back against the stone archway. "What happens now?" Draco looked down at her. He thought about the notebook on his nightstand. He thought about the lists of fears he had written down, and how small they seemed now, standing here in the sunlight with her. "I suppose," Draco said slowly, "that depends on the rules. I think we've established that you're not very good at following them," Hermione teased gently. "True," Draco conceded. He took a half step closer. He was breaking the personal space rule again. He didn't care. But I'm excellent at improvising. Hermione looked up at him, her golden eyes searching his face. Are you? For instance, Draco said, his voice dropping to a murmur that was for her alone. I'm currently considering a new rule. Rule number 42. Oh? Hermione raised an eyebrow. And what does rule number 42 entail? Draco looked at her mouth. Then he looked back at her eyes. He saw the anticipation there, the breath held in her chest. Rule number 42, Draco recited softly. When walking Hermione Granger to class, one must carry her books, because she is stubborn and carries too many, and it looks heavy. Hermione blinked, surprised. She looked down at the towering stack of encyclopedias in her arms. She bit her lip. That's actually a very practical rule. I thought so. Draco reached out. She hesitated for a split second, then surrendered the stack to him. Their fingers brushed during the transfer, a slow, deliberate friction of skin against skin that sent that familiar spark of static through Draco's veins. He took the weight of the books easily, tucking them under one arm. Any other new rules? Hermione asked, her voice slightly breathless. Draco looked at her. He felt a surge of courage, fueled by the morning sun and the memory of her note. One more, he said, but I haven't written it down yet. I need to test the hypothesis first. I'm a scientist, Hermione whispered, stepping closer until the tips of their shoes touched. I support experimental data. Draco smiled. It came easier this time. Rule number 43, he said softly. If she looks at you like that, like you didn't just spend 7 years being an idiot, but like you might be something worth knowing, you are obligated to ask her to Hogsmeade this weekend. Hermione's breath hitched. Her eyes grew wide, shimmering with sudden emotion. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the boy beneath the prejudices, the man beneath the mistakes. That seems like a strict rule, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed laughter. What if she says no? Then I'll have to write a very depressing entry in the book, Draco said dryly, and probably reinstate the ban on blue jumpers. Hermione reached out and adjusted the lapel of his robe, her hand lingering over his heart. She could surely feel it beating. We can't have that, she murmured. The jumper is very comfortable. Is that a yes, Granger? It's a yes, Draco. The bell rang, a loud clamoring sound that echoed through the corridor, signaling the start of class. Students began to file past them, shooting curious glances at the head girl and the ex-Slytherin prince standing intimately close in the doorway. Draco didn't flinch. He didn't step away. He shifted the books to his other arm and offered her his free elbow. Shall we? He asked. Babbling hates tardiness. Rule number 8. Hermione laughed, slipping her arm through his. It felt natural. It felt right. It felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. You know, she said, as they walked into the classroom together, ignoring the sudden silence that fell over the room. I think I might need to borrow that notebook. Absolutely not, Draco said, guiding her to a desk. His desk, he decided. They were sitting together now. It's classified information, top secret. I just want to make a few more edits, she whispered, sitting down and pulling a quill from her bag. Draco sat beside her. He watched her organize her parchment. He watched her tuck a curl behind her ear. He watched her look at him and smile. A private, brilliant thing, just for him. "You can edit whatever you want, Granger," Draco said, leaning back in his chair, feeling happier than he had ever been in his life. "I think I'm done with the rules for a while." He looked at the empty desk surface where just days ago he had left his sanity bound in black leather. "I think," he added, his gaze softening as he met her eyes, "I'd rather just improvise." Hermione beamed, and under the table, her foot gently nudged his. Draco Malfoy didn't count to 3. He didn't look at the floor. He looked right at her, and he kept looking, knowing that for the first time he didn't have to look away to be safe. He was already home.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for listening to this story. I honestly had so much fun writing this. Poor Drago, he was so scared, wasn't he? He wrote all those strict rules just to survive. He told himself, don't look at her, don't smile, don't look in the hair. It was very funny, but also very sweet. I think we all feel like that sometimes. We try to be cool on outside, but inside we just are nervous. And Hermione, she was perfect. She knew his secret, but she was kind. I loved the ending on the tower. It felt very warm and cozy. Now I have a question for you. Imagine you have a secret diary. What is your rule number one? It is about law, or is it about school, or maybe it is about food? Write your rule in the comments below. I really want to read them. Please like this video if you smiled today. See you in the next story. Bye.